On the 15th of September 1666, when Sophia Dorothea of Celle came into the world, her parents, George William, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and Eleanor d'Olbreuse, a French noblewoman, had been happily married for 1 year. Although their marriage seemed like a regular one, it was actually a morganatic marriage. Before meeting Eleanor, Duke George William was supposed to marry Princess Sophia, the daughter of Frederick V, Elector Palatine of the Rhine, and Elizabeth Stuart, according to the request of the members of the state in Hanover, who wanted an heir. After initially agreeing to marry Princess Sophia, the Duke started having second thoughts. Realizing that he could only marry for love, he asked his younger brother Ernest Augustus to take his place. A contract was signed by the two brothers in which George William gave up a part of his revenues and agreed not to marry in order to leave his inheritance and his rights to Ernest Augustus, who would marry his bride and take over his ducal obligations. So in 1658 Ernest Augustus married Princess Sophia, and 2 years later they had a son, Prince George Louis. Ernest Augustus and his wife regarded the little Sophia Dorothea as the product of the affair between George William and his madame. After their wedding, Eleanor was granted the title of Madame von Harburg. George William sheltered Eleanor from the hostility of his brother and the hatred of the Duchess Sophia, who considered Eleanor of low birth. Realizing that his wife and his daughter would be barred from inheriting his dominions, the Duke of Celle bought estates and lands and settled them upon Eleanor and his daughter. And he went even further than that. In exchange for the troops he sent to help the emperor in various military campaigns, Leopold I granted the legitimizing of Sophia Dorothea and gave Eleanor the title of Countess of Wilhelmsburg. By the time Sophia Dorothea was 10 years old, her father had petitioned the emperor to allow him to legally marry Eleanor. And when he was successful in renegotiating the previous contract between him and Ernest Augustus, the two brothers signed a new agreement in May 1676, by which Duke George William was free to enter into a matrimony with Eleanor. After marrying Eleanor before his court, the sovereign of Celle was delighted that his consort was elevated to the title of Duchess. Their daughter, who would bear the title of a princess by birth of Brunswick-Lüneburg, was present at her parents' wedding, but not Ernest Augustus and his wife. When the princess reached her teenage years, her mother made sure that any suitor who was not equal to her daughter's rank would be kept away. Quite often the princess was spending her time with her friend Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, who was about the same age as her. He belonged to a wealthy noble family from Sweden and had been staying at Celle to receive his military training. So when Count Konigsmark was told to leave Celle, he went to England to finish his education and stayed there for some years. Meanwhile, the princess was betrothed to Prince Augustus Frederick, the son of Duke Anthony Ulrich of Wolfenbüttel, a cousin of George William, but soon after their engagement, the prince died at the siege of Philipsburg. In 1679, when John Frederick, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, died without an heir, Ernest Augustus was placed in the favourable position of reigning over Hanover, where he installed himself, surrounded by his court. Meanwhile, his son, George Louis, turned 19, and in order to acquire some polished manners, he was sent to the court of Louis XIV, but to the Duke's despair, his son returned home not much changed. Then the Duchess Sophia sent her son to England in the hope that he would marry an English princess, but that proved unsuccessful, and the prince returned to Hanover. As a result, a marriage plan between George Louis and his cousin Sophia Dorothea was arranged. Knowing that the Duchess Sophia disliked Eleanor and the court of Celle, Ernest Augustus presented to his wife the multiple advantages of such a union. Princess Sophia Dorothea was wealthy, the feud between the two families would end, and the ties between the principalities of Celle and Hanover would be strengthened. Convinced by such arguments, the Duchess Sophia travelled to Celle in September 1682 and presented herself before Duke George William, saying that she desired nothing more than mending the relationship between the courts of Celle and Hanover, and reminded him that the services offered to the emperor by the troops of Hanover and Celle could bring about the raising of any of the two duchies to an electorate. The marriage of his daughter to her son would only increase the chances of such success. The Duke of Celle immediately communicated to his wife that he had consented to such a union. In vain Eleanor protested and implored him not to sacrifice their daughter by marrying her to someone who was said to have a profligate character and bad manners. The Duke was unmoved and told his wife to break the news to their daughter. Knowing that George Louis despised her and her mother, the princess declared that she would need to be dragged to the altar before consenting to become his wife. When Sophia Dorothea was introduced to her future husband, she fainted in her mother's arms. George Louis, who had nothing but contempt for Sophia Dorothea, did not make the slightest attempt to make himself liked by the princess. About the marriage, his mother said, "He does not care much for the match itself, but 100,000 thalers a year tempted him, as they would have tempted anybody else, without speaking of a pretty wife, who will find a match in my son, the most stubborn boy who ever lived, and who has round his brains such a thick crust that I defy any man or woman ever to discover what is in them." George William gave his daughter a lot of money and estates, but according to the marriage contract all went to her husband, upon whose good will she would depend. She would have no money of her own. Before the marriage was solemnized, one favor was asked, George Louis to send away his mistress. He reluctantly agreed. The wedding was celebrated on the 21st of November 1682 in the castle of Celle, but despite the joyful festivities, the couple was deeply unhappy and mistrustful of each other. From there they travelled to the court of Hanover to begin their life together. With her grace and demeanour, Sophia Dorothea captured the people's hearts, and her father-in-law seemed eager to do anything to make her feel welcome at Hanover, as she was the source of great riches added to the coffers of his court, modelled on Versailles. The princess spent her days writing letters, doing needlework, and having walks in the garden with her lady-in-waiting that she had brought from Celle. In November 1683, Prince George Augustus was born to the couple, but his arrival did not improve the couple's relationship. George Louis sought relief from his married life by returning to military service and taking part alongside the soldiers ordered from Hanover and Celle to assist the emperor in the campaign against the Turks. 3 years later, the couple had a daughter whom they named Sophia Dorothea. As George Louis was indifferent to his wife and treated her coldly, the princess found consolation and happiness in her 2 children. When Ernest Augustus promoted his prime minister, Platen, to the title of count, his wife became Countess Platen. She was the mistress of Ernest Augustus and was delighted with her new status, which increased her influence over the court of Hanover. As Countess Platen disliked Sophia Dorothea, she made it her mission to increase the animosity between George Louis and his wife. When the Countess introduced Melusine von der Schulenburg to George Louis, she became his new mistress. Finding herself alone, ignored and unloved, Sophia Dorothea had an encounter with an old acquaintance whom she had last seen 10 years before. He was Count von Konigsmarck, who reappeared in Hanover in the spring of 1688. By that time he had lived at different courts of Europe and gained the reputation of a brave and audacious nobleman, always animated by the spirit of military adventure. Therefore, Duke Ernest Augustus appointed him a colonel of his Hanoverian guards. Königsmarck was witty and gallant, and his polished manners quickly won him popularity at the court of Hanover. At a ball given in honor of the Duke and the Duchess of Celle visiting Hanover, Königsmarck and Sophia Dorothea danced together and made a wonderful pair. Countess Platen, who was impressed by the grace of Königsmarck's dancing, approached the Count and congratulated him in glowing terms. When rumors about an intrigue between them abounded, Königsmarck went to see the princess and assured her of his utmost devotion, saying that he just wanted to win the favour of the influential Countess Platen. The princess was unaware that Königsmarck had tender feelings for her, so they bade each other farewell, and in the autumn of 1689 he accompanied the Hanoverian troops to fight alongside the imperial forces against the Turks in the Peloponnese. After his return to Hanover, Königsmarck started writing letters to the princess, saying that without her life was worthless to him. For a while they managed to see each other in secret, and with the help of Königsmarck's sister and the princess's lady-in-waiting, their letters reached one another as intended. But when some of their letters fell into the wrong hands, their affair began to arouse suspicion. Having heard such rumours, the Duchess of Celle begged her daughter to end her communication with Königsmarck. But the princess found herself being torn between the fear of being discovered and her growing affection for Königsmarck. Their correspondence continued while Königsmarck served in the campaign in Flanders in 1692 as colonel of a Hanoverian regiment, when he was away for 6 months during the War of the Great Alliance against Louis XIV. When the fear that their letters had been opened took hold, Königsmarck started worrying. Yet the princess was more concerned about the safety of her lover than the consequences of being discovered. At the Battle of Steenkerk on the 3rd of August 1692, the French were victorious, and the princess feared that Königsmarck was among the lost soldiers. But to her delight she learned that he had survived, and she wrote to him saying, Had you fallen, my grief would have discovered everything. I should not have had the strength to restrain myself, and indeed it would have been immaterial to me whether I was lost or not, for without you life would be intolerable, and imprisonment within 4 walls pleasanter than to go on living in the world. When the military campaign ended, Konigsmark returned to Hanover in disguise to be reunited with the princess. It was the perfect opportunity for them to meet, as the court was more preoccupied with the anticipated investiture of the Duke of Hanover with the electorate than to pay attention to the 2 lovers. Shortly after that, in December 1692, Ernest Augustus received the title of Elector of Hanover. As Königsmarck's position at the Hanoverian court was precarious, given that rumours about the affair between the princess and him were spreading, the princess made up her mind. She was willing to give up her rank in search for happiness with the man she loved, and decided to flee with Königsmarck to some far-off lands. Königsmarck was wealthy, but at the time he did not have ready money, as he had been neglecting his financial affairs. When the princess read over her marriage contract and realized how disadvantageous it was to her, she burst into tears. Trying to comfort her, her mother said she would sell her jewels so her daughter could get some sort of income. The princess approached her father, saying that she wanted to live independently and asked him to give her a separate establishment, but he refused to help her. Meanwhile, Countess Platen, who dreaded being powerless, was picturing the day when her protector Ernest Augustus would be no more. The Prince-Elector would become the only authority, and Sophia Dorothea would become electress with more dignity and prestige. Her chance to ruin and disgrace the princess was the affair of Sophia Dorothea with Königsmarck. She approached the elector and spoke negatively about his daughter-in-law, and at the same time she told the Prince-Elector about his wife's behavior in relation to Königsmarck. So spies were summoned to watch the 2 lovers. Then Countess Platen approached Königsmarck with an offer of marrying her daughter, promising him in return his promotion in the army and her influential support. He rejected her offer with indignation, and to hurt her pride, he remarked that he would not marry her daughter because she was the daughter of Countess Platen by the Elector of Hanover. But the unexpected accession of his friend Duke Frederick Augustus to the electorate of Saxony gave Königsmarck hope. So he travelled to Dresden to see his friend, with whom he had fought together during the campaign in Flanders, and remind the elector that he owed him 30,000 crowns. Given that he was short of money, the elector offered Königsmarck instead the post of Major General in the Saxon army with a good salary attached to it. Pressed by his circumstances, Königsmarck accepted the offer and attended many of the feasts and court entertainments initiated by the new elector. On such occasions he revealed some of the happenings at the Hanoverian court, presenting detailed stories about the Elector of Hanover and his mistress, about George Louis and his mistress, and other such like tales which were reported back to Hanover by informers at Dresden. When all those things reached the ears of Ernest Augustus, Prince George Louis and Countess Platen, they were furious. Meanwhile in Hanover, the princess was making efforts to advance her plans that would lead to the separation from her husband. One day George Louis burst into her apartments, saying she was connected to all the reports and gossip coming from the Saxon court, and scolded her for her favours to Konigsmark. The princess remarked that he and his mistress were the laughing stock of the courts of Europe, and she wanted a divorce from him. A heated argument followed, and the prince grabbed his wife by the throat. The frightened princess announced that her separation from him would be permanent, and she would never return to Hanover. She then travelled to Celle to ask for her parents' help and protection. Her mother offered to help her, but her father was furious about his daughter's behaviour and ordered her to return immediately to Hanover. As her husband had gone to Berlin, her parents-in-law tried to assure the princess that she wouldn't have to face him for a while. Upon her return to Hanover, she shut herself in her apartments, refusing to see anyone, and plotted her escape. 2 days after her arrival in Hanover, Königsmarck returned from Dresden. They exchanged letters and made a plan to go to Wolfenbüttel, where the princess could get the protection of her cousin, Duke Anthony Ulrich, who assured her of his support. On the 1st of July 1694, Königsmarck received a note, seeming to be from the princess, asking him to go and meet her that night. It was actually a forged letter written by Countess Platen as a trap. He disguised himself and arrived at the Leine Schloss, where he was admitted into the apartments of the princess. While the two lovers were discussing their plan of escape, Countess Platen, who had spies everywhere, informed the elector that Königsmarck was in the princess's room and urged him to sign an order for Königsmarck's arrest. She insisted that she would find means of arresting him without others knowing about it. After spending some time together and unaware of danger, Königsmarck and the princess bade each other farewell. As he was leaving the castle, the exit door was locked and he was trapped inside. 4 guards were summoned by Countess Platen to catch Königsmarck dead or alive. When they rushed upon him, Königsmarck defended as best as he could until he fell on his knees. Barely able to breathe, he whispered, "Spare the innocent princess." Wounded as he was, he opened his eyes and saw his enemy. He tried to say something, but Countess Platen brutally closed his lips with her foot, and Königsmarck died. Having heard of his death, the elector was furious about the way the countess had dealt with Königsmarck. Such a thing would bring the House of Hanover into disrepute. But to avoid that, the countess gave orders, and Königsmarck's body disappeared without a trace. The following morning, the princess was ordered not to leave her apartments. The authorities in Hanover searched Königsmarck's rooms and seized his papers. The fate of the princess was sealed when many of her letters to her lover were found. Count Platen had already been sent to speak to the Duke of Celle and inform him about his daughter's letters to Königsmarck. The content of the letters revealed Sophia Dorothea's displeasure about her father's refusal to help her escape from her husband and the House of Hanover. The Duchess of Celle begged her husband not to desert their daughter who needed his help. But the Duke was unmoved and turned against his only child. When the princess demanded to know what happened to Königsmarck, she was informed by Count Platen that he was seen leaving her room and was killed because he resisted his arrest. Having heard that, the princess broke down in tears. 2 weeks after Königsmarck's death, the princess was sent to the castle of Ahlden, where she became a state prisoner. Her divorce from Prince George Louis was decided upon, and she was ordered to sign the divorce papers on the ground of her intentional desertion. Indifferent to the reason invoked, the princess signed the document without knowing that she would never be allowed to see her children again and would be kept in a lifelong imprisonment. On the 31st of December 1694, the ties of the marriage were dissolved and annulled. The princess was given 2 rooms for her personal use and was only allowed to walk in the small garden of the castle. On certain occasions and subject to approval, she was allowed to drive her carriage for a distance of 6 miles from the castle, but only along a certain road and always accompanied by a lady-in-waiting and a guard of soldiers. Upon his father's death in January 1698, George Louis became the new Elector of Hanover. Wanting to see her children, Sophia Dorothea wrote to him asking for a pardon for her past faults and begged to be allowed to embrace her children. She received no reply. Her mother was eventually allowed to visit the princess, and through her Sophia Dorothea would receive news about her children. In 1701, the Act of Settlement passed by Parliament in England settled the succession to the crown on the Electress Sophia and her heirs. Before he died, George William had a change of heart and wanted to see his daughter, but he was advised against it by his Prime Minister. But the Duke left his vast fortune to his daughter, and the Duchess of Celle did the same. As a result, Sophia Dorothea, the prisoner of Ahlden, would become one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. When Queen Anne died, George Louis, the Elector of Hanover, was proclaimed King of Great Britain and Ireland as George I, and in September 1714 he travelled to London, accompanied by his mistress, to assume the throne. Before he left Hanover, he gave orders that Sophia Dorothea should be guarded more closely than ever. By that time she was 48 years old and she had been imprisoned for 20 years. She endured her misfortunes with dignity, she gave money to the people of the local village and spent her days writing her memoirs and even romance and poetry. In 1722, Sophia Dorothea lost her only trusted friend, her mother, who had petitioned for her daughter's release until she died. The princess, who remained surrounded by people without pity and justice, died 4 years later at the age of 60 and after 32 years in captivity. King George I was furious when he learned that the court of Hanover declared mourning for Sophia Dorothea of Celle and sent orders against it. He also protested when the court of Berlin decreed mourning for her, as she was the mother of Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, Queen Consort in Prussia, who wanted to pay her respect to her mother, whom she believed was an innocent woman. For fear of offending George I, no one dared to organize the burial of Sophia Dorothea, and the leaden coffin containing her body was kept in the vaults of the castle of Ahlden for 2 months, awaiting the king's orders. The royal orders that came in January 1727 said that the princess should be buried in a grave in the garden of the castle. But as the season was rainy, the grave diggers tried in vain to dig through the muddy ground and decided to take the coffin back to the cellar, where it remained until further orders. It was only in May that the king sent orders from England to bury the remains of the princess in the burial vaults of the church of Celle in secret and without any religious service. A month later, George I decided to travel to Hanover. On the 9th of June 1727, when he reached Ahlden on the border of Holland, the royal coach stopped to change horses. A few hours later, when the king started off again, a man appeared from the shadow and threw a letter through the window of the royal coach that landed on the king's knees. Reading the letter, the king was seized by panic. He had just read the words that Sophia Dorothea wrote to him just before she died. She denounced him for the wrong he had done to her and said that they would meet within a year and a day before the judgment of God. The king remembered what a fortune-teller had told him many years before. He would not outlive his wife 12 months. As he was superstitious, the king was seized by fear. He gradually started feeling unwell and suffered a stroke. He recovered briefly, but by the time he reached Osnabrück, his condition worsened and he died on the 11th of June 1727. Upon his father's death, George Augustus, the son of Sophia Dorothea, ascended the throne of Great Britain and Ireland as George II. On his first visit to Hanover after becoming king, he read the documents of the divorce proceedings of his parents and then burnt them, trying to destroy any document mentioning the name of his mother or Konigsmark. But during renovations of the Palace of Hanover, some workmen discovered the skeleton of a man, which was considered to be that of the missing Swedish count, Konigsmark. Orders were then given to throw his remains into the liner.